Hello and welcome to the second episode of Revisiting Mad Men. I want to start off by saying thank you to everyone who listened to the first episode, and a special thanks to those of you who got back to me and gave me some feedback on it as well. It's really helpful stuff. And of course, thank you for joining me here today as well. As always, I'll give my disclaimer that this podcast is only for people who have already finished Mad Men. I constantly spoil the show, so please only listen if you finish the entire show. With that being said, we can get straight into the episode. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoy. Season 1, Episode 2 of Mad Men. This episode is called Ladies' Room, and it was written by Matthew Weiner and directed by Alan Taylor. It originally aired on the 26th of July 2007. Let's get right into it. This episode begins with Roger, Mona, Betty and Don on a double date in looks like a fancy restaurant. And it begins with Roger being his usual charming self before bringing up the conversation of his nanny. And they also talk a little bit about psychiatry here, and Roger reflects the sort of stigma towards that, an attitude that is really still prevalent today of looking down on mental health as something that makes you weak, and seeking psychiatry as something that makes you weak also. And then Roger goes back to the conversation of nannies and asks Don about his nanny. And, you know, this being the second episode of Mad Men, it's one of the earliest overt clues that Don is a deserter, because he completely evades Roger's question about the nanny. And the writers do something that Mad Men writers can do quite often, which is they give Don a line which has two meanings. Because what Don says is that he says it's not polite to speak about oneself, and he says just think of me as Moses. I was a baby in a basket. Now this is typical of Mad Men, where they'll put a line that has two meanings, one metaphorical and one quite literal. The metaphor being that Don was like Moses, and whatever the connotations of that are. But in season 3, episode 1, we learn that this is quite literal, because in the opening of that episode, we see Don having a flashback of his mother and his father on the night he was conceived, and then 9 months later, the night he was born. And then they also show the moment that Dick Whitman was brought to his father's doorstep, and he is literally a baby in a basket at that point. And he's dropped on that doorstep to a woman who goes on to abuse him, and unfortunately, as he says in his own words, never really loved him like her own son. She was always quick to remind him that he wasn't her own. So this baby in a basket line is more literal than we're led to believe in this opening scene of this episode here. And then, in line with the title of the episode, we follow the ladies into the bathroom. Specifically, we're shown an extreme close-up of Betty's fumbling hands at this point, and she can't apply her makeup as a result. So Mona helps her with it. Mona puts on her lipstick, and during that they have a little exchange where Mona's saying, "Oh, what beautiful lips. I'm sure it mustn't be hard for you to hold on to your man," which obviously there's some dramatic irony going on there, because as the audience we know that Don is unfaithful, and I don't know if Betty knows at this point. Her face tells me that she might have an idea that her husband isn't being faithful to her. I feel like you would know that something is wrong in your marriage, but perhaps I'm wrong, and perhaps I'm giving Betty too much credit. And perhaps she does at this point believe that her husband is faithful to her. The next shot we are shown is Don and Betty in the car, and they're going home, and this is quite funny because we've just seen them getting all boozy, and now Don's behind the wheel, but that's something that was, I guess, more common back then than it is now. But Mad Men is full of those little moments where they just show us how different life might have been back then. And another example I can think of is when they're on the picnic, Don's family, and they're getting ready to leave, and instead of picking up all their litter like we've been trained to do, they just sort of empty the contents of the blanket on the grass and drive off. But anyway, back to this episode. Don and Betty are in the car, and Betty says that she's feeling sick, and Don is acting cool and Don-like. Betty says that it seems to her that Roger was inviting Don to confide in him about his past and about his childhood. And Don says he was raised to believe it was a sin of pride to go on about oneself like that, which reveals a little bit about I believe it was his stepmother who was religious and might have got that into his head. And then we cut to a scene of them in bed, and Betty is still trying to get something out of Don here. And she just straight up asks him at this point, "Did you have a nanny?" And he says no. And then Betty makes a clever remark about, oh, so your parents are responsible for all of this. I would love to meet them, and I'd love to thank them one day. In that, it's revealed that even Betty hasn't met his parents, which once again is even more clues that he's a deserter, and it's looking very suspicious at this point for Don, because this line tells us that even his marriage is barely even a marriage. In episode 1, we're shown that he's a serial cheater on his wife, and in this episode it's revealed that Betty hasn't even met his parents, so it makes us question what this marriage is built on and how much Betty knows about Don, and if it is as little as it is, it raises some questions about Don's past, and I think we're planted a little bit of clues here that Don is on the run. Don is a deserter. And then in the next scene, we're just shown a short clip of Betty and Don in bed, and Don's asleep, and Betty comes up next to his head and asks who's in there. Just hammering in the point that Betty really doesn't know her own husband. In the next scene, we are in the office, and it's a scene of Joan and Peggy walking through the office, and the first line here that Joan says is, "Peggy, next step is accessories," which is perhaps reflects some of Joan's priorities of appearance, showing what she values and what society values in women, which is their appearance and their looks and their clothes and fashion. And what's interesting about that is Peggy's response. She basically ignores what Joan says and begins bragging rather about her payslip, and it in turn reflects her priorities, which are less about appearance and less about fashion or accessories. She's focused on her career. She's focused on climbing the corporate ladder in a sense. Although, of course, as the show progresses, we see how career-orientated Joan is also, especially by the end of the series, where we see Joan starting her own company, Holloway Harris. And then we're shown our second scene in a ladies' bathroom where we follow Joan and Peggy into the ladies' room, and there's a character called Bridget there who's looking into the mirror and crying. Joan walks on and ignores her as if she sees it on a regular basis, and Peggy, being the newbie, asks Bridget if she was okay, to which she gets no response. This is one of maybe 3 or 4 times we see a woman crying in the Sterling Cooper ladies' room, and I'm not sure exactly why, but there is something to be said about the fact that these women go to the bathroom in this very male-dominated environment, i.e. the workplace, and they go to this bathroom where there's only women, and that's the one place where they can feel comfortable expressing their emotions. The next scene is in Don's office, and the men here are discussing the new campaign for the new Right Guard aerosol can that's come out. I've not actually researched this, but I think they mention here that this was the first deodorant can to be have that spraying mechanism that we're so used to seeing now. And in this meeting is Don, Ken, Paul Kinsey, Salvatore, and Dale. The men here are generally just having a laugh, obviously talking about the product, but also ribbing on each other, mainly on Ken, who apparently has some BO. And whilst they're sort of ribbing on Ken, Bert Cooper comes in, and he walks into Ken being wrestled on the table by the other boys, whilst Don is overlooking everything. And then Don steps out of the office, and Cooper and Sterling introduce the idea of a Nixon campaign, which Don clearly isn't a fan of. And throughout this conversation, the boys in the background are heard having a laugh and being kind of raucous. And there's a funny scene here where Cooper is talking, and we see a flame behind his ear, presumably from the deodorant can. And the boys are just being children really in that office, whilst Cooper and Sterling and Don have this conversation. And as Cooper's walking away here, they zoom into his feet, just to show us that he's not wearing shoes, which I think is the first time we see that. I'm just wondering if this is the first time we ever see Cooper in this show. I think it is the first time we see Bert Cooper. Anyway, moving on, the next scene shows us Ken, Harry, and Dale receiving a postcard from Pete Campbell, who is on his honeymoon. Pete is currently in Niagara Falls with his newly wedded wife, and whilst they're looking at this postcard, Peggy and Joan come, and that creates something interesting too, because when they tell Peggy about the postcard, they zoom into her face, and we see a little bit of something in her face. I mean, it could be jealousy, it could be sadness, it could be heartbreak, we don't know. I don't think we ever really find out the extent to which Peggy had emotions for Pete. I think we can presume, by the fact that nothing transpired between them two, we can probably presume that she maybe wasn't in love with him as much as, I don't know. It's a tricky one, how Peggy feels for Pete. I don't think she does love him really. I'm not sure. I'm sure there's interpretation. I'm sure you could interpret it as she does. I mean, her face here surely would suggest that. Then the next shot is of the 5 of them at lunch. It's the 5 people who were looking at the postcard earlier, and they're flirting with Peggy, mainly Ken flirting with Peggy. And then he rubs her waist and pulls her closer to him and says something along the lines of, why don't we take the rest of the afternoon off, go visit the zoo and see what the animals are up to. And Peggy politely declines. She simply says, I should get back to work. The next scene is one of my favourites of the episode. It's Betty and Francine in Betty's kitchen, and they're discussing, they're smoking and drinking coffee and chatting, and Francine brings up Helen Bishop, the new neighbour who's just moved in down the road. And significantly to Betty and Francine, she's a divorcee. They discuss that this means house prices will go down. But more importantly than that, I think it's Francine's line where she says, can you imagine worrying about money at this stage of our lives? This is a really fantastic line because it brings up the predicament that a lot of women had and still have to this day of being in a marriage that they may not be right for them, but they are simply financially dependent on their husbands. And what that means is, even if you're in a marriage with someone who you don't love, what can you do as a woman in that position? You can leave, but it means you're going to have to find some sort of means of bringing up your kids if you have any. Of course, Helen Bishop has 2. She has Glenn Bishop, who we'll meet, and he's actually played by Matthew Weiner's son, and the baby, who we don't see much of in this show, but we do see a little bit of the baby. Helen's baby, that is. But again, Mad Men here is just bringing up this very real, very hard fact of being a woman in any time, but more so in the 60s than now. And what we've seen in the last 50 or 60 years is the rate of divorce increase, which is believed to be a direct impact of there being more women in the workplace, more women in high positions. And what we see by the end of the show is people like Peggy and people like Joan who are financially independent. And Joan very clearly in season 7 doesn't have to remarry to Richard after divorcing Greg Harris, that is, because she is a financially dependent woman and she is now going to be the head of this new company. And this brings us back to Mad Men's main philosophy, which I believe, as dark and as somber as this show can be, I believe that ultimately underneath it all, Mad Men is about progress and it's about moving forward, to use Don's words. And that's what we see in Peggy and Joan. You can almost say this show is bookended by this scene here with Francine and Betty talking about how trapped they are in their marriages because of this huge question about finance and how they're going to survive if they ever do leave their husbands. And by the end, we've seen two of our main characters, Joan and Peggy, able to do exactly that. Of course, Peggy is with Stan by the end, but there's no doubts about her being financially independent. If she wanted to, she could fend for herself. And the same goes for Joan, who obviously is fending for herself by the end of the show. And I think the position that the women in the show end up in is one of the big points of evidence that Mad Men is about progress, and it is about, ultimately, it's a positive show, I think. It's not saying that we've completely eradicated racism, sexism, or any of these things, but at least in my opinion, at least it seems in Matthew Weiner's opinion that we are moving in the right direction. But this line that Francine says isn't the only reason why this is my favourite scene. The other reason it's my favourite scene is because of the joke when Sally comes in with a dry cleaning bag over her head. Now to us, of course, alarm bells are ringing saying, get that bag off this child's head. But just to mention, this is the first time we see Kiernan Shipka as Sally Draper. Sally is probably one of my favourite characters in the show, and Kiernan Shipka's portrayal of Sally is near perfect in my opinion. She's a fantastic actor. But there's a great joke here because, as I say, there's alarm bells ringing in our head, but Betty's worry is about her clothes. She says something along the lines of, Sally, you're going to be a very, very sorry young lady if the clothes from that dry cleaning bag are on the floor. Which tells us a little bit about how society has changed with regards to how we raise our children now. And of course, the flip side of that is that today we have helicopter parenting where kids are monitored constantly. And her following line is also revealing because she barks at Sally to go check on her baby brother. Again, just driving home the point that, parents weren't watching their kids the way some parents are now. Kids were either dangerously playing in the other room with bags over their heads, or, as we're constantly shown in Mad Men, they were just told to go watch TV, which had its negative effects also, which we'll get onto in later episodes. The next scene shows Sally, Betty and Bobby in the car, And we're actually shown Helen Bishop, the divorcee who's moving in. And we're shown Helen struggling with moving into a house. She's trying to drag this heavy box across her front lawn, and Betty watches her. There's a little bit of foreshadowing here, as we know that Betty is also going to be a divorcee. And then Betty has, it looks like a panic attack to me. I don't know what the correct term is for what happens to Betty here, but her hands go numb again and she crashes into a neighbour's lawn. As soon as she's able to gather herself, she steps outside the car and checks on her kids, who are absolutely fine. They're having a laugh in the back seat. They're not hurt. And then we're shown a very distraught Betty sit beside her car on the floor. And the director here makes an interesting choice to fade. I don't know if it's the director's choice or Matthew Weiner's choice, but they make a choice here to fade out from Betty's distraught face into Don and Midge having sex. And this is, according to Betty, Don's at work at this point. She obviously doesn't know that he's called in sick and that he's off philandering with another woman. And the next scene is Betty in the kitchen plating up fish fingers for the kids and giving them their dinner when Don walks in. This scene here is quite heartbreaking because it shows Don just lying to Betty about why she couldn't get hold of him after the accident. He says that it's because Freddie Rumsen was so drunk that they had to carry him out of the bar, when obviously we know he was with Midge. And John Hamm's acting here is really great, as because he's making eye contact with Betty, and as soon as he starts to lie, his eyes dart around the room and they start wondering, which is a telltale sign that someone is not telling the truth. So I thought that was a great choice from John Hamm there. His acting's very nuanced, very subtle. And then the kids are told to go and watch TV, and Betty and Don can speak in private. And Betty brings up this idea of seeing a psychiatrist, which Don doesn't like the sound of. We know that his views on psychiatry from episode 1 are that it's basically nonsense. I think he does use the word bullshit at some point. He just believes that psychiatry is the doctor's answer to I don't know. And then we cut to Don and Betty getting into bed, and Don's doing some press-ups with his shirt off, and they start talking about mental health again. And Don says a very telling line, which is, I thought psychiatry was, where people go when they're unhappy. And I look at you, Betty, and you don't look unhappy to me. And she responds, of course I'm happy. And I complimented John Hamm's acting in the previous scene, and I'll compliment January Jones' acting in this scene, because the way she says, of course I'm happy, is very, very telling. Because to me, it reveals that she clearly is lying. She's not happy at all. She has to force those words out of her. And Don is ridiculous to point at her kids and her face and their house, as if to say, how could you, and he says it later on in the show, how could you not be happy with all of this? But it's because he doesn't understand that satisfaction and true peace and true happiness doesn't come from these material things, and it certainly doesn't come from how one looks. Just because Betty has an attractive face doesn't mean she's happy, and Don of all people should know that. He's so out of touch with his emotions at this point of the show that he doesn't recognize that yet. He doesn't recognize that even he hasn't found any peace or any happiness. As the show goes on, I think he gets a better understanding of those emotions. I think that's what Mad Men is about. The next scene is back in Don's office, and the boys are pitching their idea for the Right Guard commercial. And their idea for the campaign is to have it centered around an astronaut in space, because everyone loves astronauts and astronauts are cool. And I think the point of this scene is that it's actually meant to be a good campaign idea. But Don, who's preoccupied with his own marital problems and his question of what do women want, he fails to see the good in the advert. And instead he says that when people think of an astronaut, they think of the world coming to an end, which he's just projecting at this point. I don't think people think that when they think about space travel. But I think Don does, because Don is deeply, deeply anxious and scared and full of fear. And thus he's projecting that onto everybody else. And then he suggests a really poor idea about the cowboy, and I think this is when it's clear that the astronaut idea was much better. The cowboy idea sounds very boring. And then Don clearly talking about Betty at this point. Not that the boys know this, but he's saying, what if there's something women want that we don't know, this mysterious wish. And he's perplexed by it all. And I think as an audience, we're not as perplexed as he is. We know what the mysterious wish is that Betty wants, which is some emotional honesty, just a little bit of truth and transparency about who Don is. At this point, we don't know the extent to which Don is lying to his wife. We know that he's cheating on her, but we don't know that his name isn't Don Draper. We don't know that she knows nothing about his past, about what he gets up to at work. And so the mysterious wish that he's so perplexed by isn't so perplexing to the audience. In the next scene, we see Paul going to lunch with Peggy, and I actually really like Paul throughout this tour. Although it's not long before he forces himself on Peggy in a later scene. He's actually quite funny and charming in this tour, where he's explaining the different positions in Sterling Cooper and giving Peggy a rough tour of the offices as well. Elizabeth Moss, as she is in practically every single scene in this show, she's absolutely brilliant here. She's really, really endearing, and just some great subtleties in her acting here that I really enjoyed. And then we cut to Roger entering Don's office, and naturally Don offers Roger a drink. And as usual, any scene with Roger is usually hilarious. Don brings up the recurring question in this episode to Roger, and he asks Roger, what do women want? To which Roger says, who cares? And then Don says that line, which is, who could not be happy with all of this? And this to me reveals Don's stupidity. Because for him to think that he could be satisfied and fulfilled in his life when his marriage is a sham, his whole name, his whole life, everything about him is a lie. For him to look at his life and think, I should be happy, tells me that he's an idiot. And the next scene shows a drunk Don returning home, and his kids are in front of the TV. And they're actually watching the show that Midge recommended to Don earlier in the episode, which is the show called People Are Funny. And Don goes into the kitchen and presents to Betty a white gold watch, thinking that this is the answer to her mysterious wish. Again, revealing Don's stupidity, thinking that throwing money at the problem will solve it. Giving a woman jewelry will solve her all her problems. It's stupid. It's completely missing the point. The point is that your wife doesn't know who you are. The point is that you're lying about who you are to everyone in your life. And a watch isn't going to fix that. And then Betty reveals a little bit about her values in this scene as well, because she talks about how awful it could have been if Sally had gotten a scar in the accident. And the reason it's revealing of her values is because she makes a point to say that it wouldn't be bad if Bobby had a scar, because a boy with a scar is nothing. But a girl, well, that would be worse than even Sally dying. For her to live on with a scar. And she says that Sally would live a long, lonely, miserable life. And at this point, we're given the impression that really she's talking about herself. She is the one who's living a long, lonely and miserable life. Her priorities are to be beautiful and to have a husband. But these things don't work out for Betty. I think she finds herself in the position where she does have a kid, where she does have a husband now, where she does have 2 beautiful kids and a beautiful house. But she still feels lonely and miserable. And interestingly, it seems that Sally, who clearly rejects her mother's values later on in the show, for example, when she gets a broken nose, she makes a comment about Betty valuing looks too much. And what we can presume by Sally's rejection of Betty's values is that she will presumably end up like Joan and Peggy. But back to the scene with Betty and Don after he's just given her the watch. It ends with Don succumbing to Betty's pressures, and he agrees that she maybe should see a psychiatrist. The next scene shows Don sitting in Midge's hallway. And I think he explains to her that Betty's currently in her meeting with the psychiatrist. I haven't got much else to say about that scene. So we'll move on to the next scene, which is when Peggy goes to Paul's office, and he, as I said earlier, he shuts the door and forces himself onto Peggy, and he also crudely proposes that they put the couch in front of the door and get at it right there and then, which she again, like she did with Ken, she just refuses Paul outright. Whether this is because she's in love with Pete or not, I don't know. I personally don't think she is in love with Pete. I mean, maybe she has some feelings, but I don't think that's why she's refusing these men. I think she just doesn't like Ken and she just doesn't like Paul. And immediately after this scene where Peggy's just been forced onto by a man, we see her understandably quite irritated, and on top of that, Joan comes and starts telling Peggy that she can't go home early, and because she made some typos on some admin work that she did, and she has to correct that before she leaves the office that day. And then the two start to talk about what's on Peggy's mind, about how the men have been treating her in the office, and Joan attempts to give Peggy some advice, but really she's just insulting Peggy. And then we'll show this really stylized scene of men walking past Peggy's office, some winking at her, some smiling, and then Peggy opens the drawer and we see that she's actually taken the postcard that Pete Campbell sent. And then straight after this, we follow her to the ladies' room once again, where, funnily enough, there's a woman crying again, just like there was earlier in the show. The next scene is Betty in the psychiatrist's office, and she talks about her hands. She talks about the bomb. This is sort of Cold War era. And eventually Betty brings up her mother and her mother's recent passing. And the scene ends with Betty smoking a cigarette, and she says, "We're all so lucky to be here," which I guess there's a little bit of irony in. She doesn't feel lucky to be where she is. She feels lonely and depressed, presumably. And then we go back to Midge's apartment, and the two are lying in bed, I believe, and Don is lying in bed and Midge is getting ready to leave somewhere. And we see this moment where Don poses the question to Midge now, where he says, "What do women want?" And he's struck with this idea suddenly. And here Mad Men is making a point about what it is to be a creative person, I think. This show touches on this point in several episodes, and this is one of those scenes where They show Don as a creative person coming up with these ideas. He's kind of always on the clock, as a lot of writers feel that they are. And what I like here is that they show him write down this idea. He says, what do women want? And it says, and he comes up with this idea, the response to the question being any excuse to get closer. And they just show him write it down, and they have a shot of him for about 3 seconds here of just him just smiling down at his notepad in the afterglow, if you like, of when you write something that you know is good. And I think that's what that look is. That's why they pause on his face for a while there. Immediately after this scene, we're showing Betty and Don on their own fancy date now, and Don is telling a funny story about something he read in the Journal American, an article about something to do with phone books or whatnot. And then there's a rare moment that is actually sweet between Betty and Don, where she holds his hand and says, this is nice. And it does seem sweet to me, but it's not that sweet when you think that the scene directly before it was Don in Midge's apartment cheating on his wife, and the scene directly following it shows that Betty has zero confidentiality between herself and her psychiatrist, because we are shown the couple, they come home, Betty goes upstairs, Don goes into his office, and I think they might be making a point here. The episode is called Ladies' Room, yet it ends with a scene of Don going into his room, his office in the house, which is a room that I doubt Betty goes into much. So you could call it maybe his room, the man's room in the house, the office. And in there he calls up Betty's psychiatrist, and it's revealed that even with her doctor, she hasn't got any privacy. And she's kind of infantilized in a way, because Don is checking in with the doctor and they discuss the nature of her sessions. And the final shot is the camera sort of zooming out of Don's office, and the final shot is actually of the doorway into the kitchen, which might also be considered the ladies' room, since we see Betty and Francine sitting in there, and it's generally considered the female domain in the house as well, with Don's office generally being considered the male domain of the house. And it ends with a beautiful song by the Cardigans called Great Divide. And I think we're left with a feeling of sadness for Betty, because even in her psychiatry session, she hasn't got privacy, and her husband is privy to what she says in there. I think the really sad thing is the feeling of entrapment Betty must feel, and at this point we empathise with her, because she is completely trapped in all directions. The episode has already touched on the financial side of things and why it would be difficult for any woman in Betty's position to leave their husband when you've got 2 kids and when you don't work yourself. She hasn't worked in a long time, Betty. She used to work. And of course, on top of that, she's clearly got her own mental health issues, such as her fumbling hands, which I'm guessing is some sort of anxiety disorder, or maybe even a mild form of a panic attack. And on top of that, her mum just passing. So we know that this woman has a lot on her mind. And this episode was centered a lot around Betty. But I also think of the other women in the episode. Peggy, of course, whose storyline develops a lot more in future episodes with regards to her pregnancy. And of course, Joan's story develops into a great story arc as well. Anyway, that's all I have to say about this episode. Do join us next week, and we will be discussing Season 1, Episode 3. See you then.